Gela, Sicily, July 10th, 1943. The night was heavy with heat and dust. Somewhere beyond the ridge, German armor was moving, a grinding rhythm of steel and thunder rolling toward the sea. In the shattered streets of Gela, British and Canadian infantry crouched between broken walls. Their rifles felt useless against the mechanical beasts advancing through the dark. For months, they had watched tanks turn men into ghosts, invincible machines that shrugged off bullets and mortars alike. But this night was different. Lance Corporal Robert Harris of the British 1st Infantry crouched behind a crumbled archway, clutching a strange, awkward-looking weapon. It was nothing like a rifle, more like a tube with a spring and a bomb at the end. The men called it that damned catapult. The manual called it projector, infantry, anti-tank, the Piat. The rumble grew louder. A Panzer IV emerged from the shadows. Headlamps dimmed, turret sweeping left to right. Its armor glinted under the moonlight like black glass. Harris held his breath. He'd been told this weapon could pierce 3 inches of steel, but no one truly believed it. He pulled the trigger. A brutal thump echoed through the ruins. A short arc of flame. Then a sound no one expected. A metallic hiss, followed by a burst of white-hot light as the warhead struck. The Panzer jolted. Its engine coughed. Smoke erupted from the turret seam. Seconds later, the hatch burst open. A figure climbed out, screaming, his uniform burning. Then another, then silence. Around the corner, another British soldier whispered, almost afraid of his own words. Bloody hell. It melted right through it. That night, in Sicily, superstition found a new face. Soldiers spoke of it in disbelief. A weapon so small, yet so deadly. It felt like witchcraft. And as dawn broke over the Mediterranean, the age of invincible tanks was over. Because behind that strange weapon lay a revolution, not in size, but in science, a revolution born from chemistry, geometry, and a discovery that changed modern warfare forever. The age of the tank. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the great powers swore they had seen the last of mechanized slaughter. Yet within a decade, Europe's generals were sketching blueprints for a new kind of war, one that would move faster, strike harder, and leave trenches behind forever. The tank, born in the mud of the Somme, had evolved from lumbering iron beasts into sleek predators. By the late 1930s, the world's armies were racing to master this new god of battle. Germany's Blitzkrieg doctrine, fast armored thrusts combined with air power, had shown how a handful of panzers could unravel entire nations. In Poland, France, and North Africa, they cut through defenses with surgical precision. For the infantry, the sight of an approaching tank became the purest form of fear. Machine guns couldn't stop it. Mortars bounced off it. Even the bravest soldiers could do little but scatter when a 25-ton monster rolled their way. The interwar years had left most nations underprepared to face this armored revolution. Traditional anti-tank guns were cumbersome, slow to move, and dependent on flat ground. Soldiers needed something lighter, something they could carry on their shoulders, aim, and fire before being crushed. But the idea of a small weapon capable of killing a tank sounded like fantasy. The physics, after all, were cruel. To pierce armor, a projectile needed immense velocity, more speed than a man could ever manage. Every gunmaker knew the rule: speed kills armor. Then, a century-old curiosity from chemistry laboratories returned to the battlefield. The discovery that changed everything in 1888. A U.S. scientist named Charles E. Monroe noticed a strange phenomenon while experimenting with explosives. When he pressed the letters U.S. into a block of dynamite and detonated it against a metal plate, the letters appeared, etched cleanly into the steel. Somehow the explosion had focused its energy inward rather than outward. It made no sense. Explosions were supposed to scatter, not concentrate. Yet here was proof that shape mattered, that the geometry of an explosive charge could direct its power like a lens. For decades, the findings sat in obscurity. Chemists filed it under curiosity. Engineers called it a hollow charge effect. Only in the late 1930s did another mind, Dr. Egon Neumann, an Austrian scientist working in Germany, refined the principle into a weapon. He added a metal cone liner inside the explosive cavity. Upon detonation, the liner collapsed inward, forming a superheated jet that could slice through steel like liquid lightning. The world would come to know it as the shaped charge, or HEAT, high explosive anti-tank round. But Neumann wasn't alone. Across the border, a Swiss engineer named Henry Mohaupt was experimenting with the same principle. His demonstration to the French army in 1939 stunned observers. A small hand grenade blowing a clean hole through armor plate. Mohaupt would later flee to the United States, carrying his ideas to the Allies just as war erupted across Europe. The race for the portable tank killer by 1940. The world was watching German panzers roll through France. The Allies' anti-tank guns, like Britain's 2-pounder or France's 25mm, struggled to keep up. Infantry squads had no answer. The question echoed through command circles. How do you stop a tank without another tank? That question drove parallel experiments in Britain, America, and Germany, all guided by the same secret physics of hollow charges. In Britain, engineers at the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research tinkered with spigot mortars and shaped warheads. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department tested a curious contraption, a shoulder-fired launcher using a rocket-propelled heat warhead. Its inventors, Edward Uhl and Leslie Skinner, called it the bazooka. Meanwhile, in Germany, scientists weaponized their own research into handheld anti-tank grenades and launchers. They called them Panzerfaust, Armor Fist, and Panzerschreck, Tank Terror. Each was brutally simple, a shaped charge with a tube or a stick to hold it. The idea was spreading, not because armies trusted it, but because desperation forced them to try. The war was moving faster than doctrine could follow. Skepticism and breakthroughs. Even as these inventions took shape, skepticism ran deep. Generals and gunners scoffed at the thought that a slow, low-velocity weapon could pierce hardened armor. Impossible, they said. A grenade cannot defeat a tank. But field trials silenced doubts. In 1942, British tests showed that a 2.5-inch shaped charge could penetrate more than 3 inches of steel. American trials achieved the same with even smaller warheads. For the first time, infantrymen could carry the power of an anti-tank gun in their arms. The mathematics were unforgiving, yet miraculous. The jet from a shaped charge reached speeds over 8,000 meters per second, with temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees, not melting armor, but punching through it with pure pressure and velocity. It wasn't sorcery. It was science, invisible, focused, and lethal. By 1943, the technology had matured enough to enter mass production. The Allies rushed it to the Mediterranean theater, just in time for the invasion of Sicily, where it would announce its arrival with that haunting whisper: thump, hiss, silence. The shaped charge had found its battlefield, and soon every soldier, tank crew, and general in the world would learn its name. From blueprints to battlefields, by early 1943, the Allies faced an armored nightmare. Across North Africa, German panzer divisions, commanded by the legendary Erwin Rommel, had turned desert plains into tank arenas. British Crusaders and American Shermans were locked in duels they often lost. Infantry units were left defenseless once their guns were outflanked. The situation was untenable. Commanders sent urgent cables back to London and Washington. "We need portable anti-tank weapons, immediately." In response, factories, workshops, and research sites erupted into feverish work. The British turned to a curious hybrid of mortar and spring gun. It was crude, heavy, and awkward, but it could fire a 2.5-pound shaped charge bomb up to 100 yards. Its name, PIAT, short for projector, infantry, anti-tank. In America, engineers took a different path. The bazooka used a small rocket to propel its warhead, eliminating recoil and extending range. The first prototypes were carried into combat by U.S. troops in Tunisia, 1942, where they stunned German crews by burning through panzer armor at close range. In Germany, Field reports of Allied heat weapons reached Berlin almost immediately. Within months, German designers produced their own portable killers. The Panzerfaust, a disposable launcher that fired a 140 mm shaped charge, capable of penetrating up to 200 mm of armor. It was devastatingly simple: a metal tube, a sight, a trigger, and one shot of death. What united all these weapons was one radical truth: velocity no longer decided victory. Geometry did. Anatomy of the magic bullet. To the untrained eye, the heat warhead looked unremarkable. A cone of steel, a casing of explosive, a tail for stability. Yet inside lay one of the most extraordinary manipulations of physics ever applied to war. At its heart was the copper or steel liner, carefully shaped into a cone and placed inside a cavity at the tip of the explosive. Upon detonation, the explosive wave collapsed the liner inward, forming a hypervelocity jet that behaved like fluid metal. But contrary to the myth, this jet did not melt armor. It pierced it through sheer pressure, over 200,000 atmospheres concentrated into a pencil-thin stream traveling faster than sound. In milliseconds, it punched through tank plates, vaporizing whatever lay in its path. To function correctly, the warhead required precise standoff distance, space between the charge and the armor to let the jet form fully. Too close, and the effect weakened. Too far, and it scattered. This small detail, often measured in mere inches, was the line between life and death for the soldier firing it. It was engineering at its most elegant, yet most brutal. First blood in North Africa. When the bazooka debuted in the deserts of Tunisia, even its creators doubted its worth. American infantrymen called it the stovepipe. It was prone to misfires, the rockets unreliable, the fuses temperamental. But the first confirmed kill changed everything. In February 1943, during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, an American soldier fired a bazooka at a Panzer III from less than 80 yards. The rocket struck the side armor and punched straight through. The tank burst into flames. The crew bailed. For the first time, infantrymen cheered as a single soldier brought down a tank without artillery. The psychological shock was immediate. Reports flooded command posts. Enemy armor destroyed by infantry-launched rocket. High command could scarcely believe it. Within months, tens of thousands of bazookas rolled off American assembly lines. In Britain, similar tales came from the streets of Sicily and Italy, where Piat teams hunted tanks from doorways and alleys. The weapon was clumsy. Its massive spring required men to stand and cock it manually. But when it worked with terrifying effect. German realization and the counterwave. By late 1943, German intelligence was well aware of the threat. On both eastern and western fronts, infantry units were reporting catastrophic tank losses to what they described as concentrated explosive shells. In response, German scientists accelerated their own shaped charge development. The Panzerfaust appeared on the Eastern Front in 1943, distributed to Volksgrenadiers and militia units in staggering numbers. Each could penetrate the frontal armor of a T-34 or Sherman. By 1945, more than 6 million Panzerfausts had been produced. The Panzerschreck, a larger reusable launcher inspired by captured bazookas, gave German squads their own portable tank deterrent. Allied tank crews soon learned to fear narrow streets and tree lines. Anywhere a single man could hide with one of those tubes. The balance between man and machine had shifted. For the first time since the rise of the tank, infantry had clawed back power. The battlefield laboratory. Every front became a testing ground for these new, magic bullets. In Italy's mountain towns, British troops with Piats defended crossroads where tanks could only approach in single file. In Normandy's hedgerows, American bazooka teams ambushed Panthers from behind bushes and haystacks. On the Eastern Front, Soviet partisans used captured Panzerfausts to stall German counterattacks. Each engagement refined the art, the range, the angles, the discipline to wait until the target's flank was exposed. It wasn't just technology. It was a new kind of warfare, where patience and nerves replaced brute firepower. By mid-1944, generals on every side understood. Whoever mastered this weapon's psychology would command the battlefield. The dawn of fear tank crews who once felt invincible began to dread the unseen. In France, British and Canadian tankers described narrow streets as death corridors. Reports of silent explosions circulated, shells that made no sound until the armor cracked. Some swore the projectiles melted steel like wax. Others whispered of chemicals or witchcraft. It was easier to believe in magic than to accept that a few pounds of explosive in the right shape could defeat millions of tons of armor design. But the truth was colder and far more terrifying. It wasn't sorcery. It was mathematics, and it had just rewritten the rules of modern war. The weapons had proven their worth. The soldiers had mastered their use. Now, as the Allies prepared for the great invasion of Europe, these magic bullets would meet their greatest test. Haze against the most formidable armored divisions Germany had ever fielded. 1. The human angle. The man behind the tube. A battlefield can turn a theory into a superstition in seconds. For the infantrymen of 1943 and 44, the shaped charge launcher was both salvation and curse. It offered a way to fight back, but at a cost few understood. Take the Piat gunners in Italy. They carried nearly 15 kilograms of awkward steel, a spring-powered launcher that kicked like a mule. Reloading meant lying exposed, winding a massive spring by hand. In the open, that could be suicide. And yet, the men did it, because if a tank broke through, nothing else could stop it. Survivors described the strange rhythm of the weapon. First came the heavy breath, then the tension of the spring, the sweat pooling in the palms. A sound, clunk. The warhead seated. A flick of the sight. Then a stillness so deep the air itself felt heavy. When the trigger was pulled, the world compressed into two sensations. A violent thump, then a hiss like tearing silk. There was no recoil, no shell case, no plume of dust like a rifle's. Just that eerie hiss as the round arced away, and a second later a bloom of light where armor met geometry. For the men firing it, there was something deeply personal about that moment. They weren't hidden behind artillery lines or tank turrets. They were alone, a single man pitting himself against a monster of steel. One British veteran, recalling a Piat shot in Normandy, said simply, "You didn't feel like a soldier. You felt like a gambler rolling his last dice." Every pull of the trigger was a wager. Courage against luck. Science against steel. The technological angle. The science of witchcraft. To understand why soldiers whispered about magic, one must step inside the warhead itself. When a shaped charge detonates, the explosive doesn't radiate outward like a grenade. It implodes. The concave cavity inside focuses the blast into a single point, much like sunlight through a magnifying glass. The metal liner, usually copper, collapses inward at immense speed, forming a jet thinner than a pencil, but hot and fast enough to pierce through any known armor of the time. The result is astonishing. A small warhead, sometimes no bigger than a hand, could drive through 100 millimeters of hardened steel, armor that once required a 50mm cannon to defeat. The Germans called it Hohlladung, the hollow charge. The British preferred the term heat, high explosive anti-tank. Both were correct, and both understated the sheer elegance of the physics involved. The effect was misunderstood even by many engineers. Tank crews, seeing molten jets sear through plate, believed it was heat that killed, that the armor had melted. In reality, it was pressure, not temperature. The metal jet behaved more like a fluid than a flame, piercing armor through speed and density rather than burning it. To create that perfect jet required a miracle of precision. The liner's cone. Angle? the explosive's detonation speed, and the fuse timing all had to align within microseconds. If even one variable slipped, the warhead would fail. It was a triumph of controlled chaos, a marriage of chemistry and geometry that made destruction look like sorcery. That's why, when a panzer crew watched their thickest armor erupt from within, they called it Wunderwaffe, a miracle weapon. But the miracle belonged not to the weapon itself, but to the invisible laws of physics that shaped it. The enemy angle, the fear inside the tank. Inside a German tank, fear had a sound. It was not the boom of artillery or the whine of machine gun fire. It was a soft hiss, followed by a flash, and then the sickening crack of steel giving way. By 1943, German panzer crews had begun to recognize that sound. They called it the Hohlladungsschuss, the hollow charge shot. At first, they laughed off reports of infantry weapons killing tanks. It sounded absurd. Then came the first real encounters, in Italy, in Normandy, and on the Eastern Front. Tankers began to notice perfect holes burned clean through side plates. Sometimes the crew survived. Sometimes they didn't even have time to scream. The psychological shift was devastating. Tanks had once symbolized power and invulnerability. Now, every ruined building, every tree line, every patch of rubble could hide death in human form. A single soldier with a tube could end a panzer. Veterans described the creeping dread of entering narrow streets. They kept hatches half open for quick escape, posted infantry escorts at every turn, and fired blindly into windows, desperate to kill whatever waited with that cursed weapon. A Wehrmacht report from Normandy captured the mood. Our armor advances hesitantly. Infantry are reluctant to follow. Every shadow conceals an explosion. In some units, commanders began to speak of Tankbesessenheit, tank obsession, a kind of paranoia that eroded morale. Crews who once scoffed at infantry now hid behind them, refusing to move without protection. The invincible had become vulnerable, and across both sides of the front, a quiet truth emerged. The war for the future of armor was no longer fought between machines. It was fought between ideas. The fear inside the tank mirrored the awe outside it. To one side it was salvation, to the other, a haunting omen. The battlefield had found a new equilibrium, and terror had changed direction. The tactical angle. Ambush over armor. In every war, there comes a moment when the map flips, when the hunted learns to stalk the hunter. The shaped charge brought that moment to life. Before 1943, infantry faced tanks with terror, not tactics. A moving wall of steel was unstoppable. After 1943, the battlefield began to whisper a different story. One of patience, angles, and silence. An infantryman armed with a Piat or bazooka no longer fought from distance. He fought from placement. Success depended on positioning, not power. In Italy's villages, soldiers waited in doorways, aiming for side armor where steel was weakest. In Normandy's hedgerows, they crept within 20 yards before firing. In the frozen forests of the Eastern Front, Soviet partisans waited at crossroads, knowing a tank column could not turn once it entered. Every environment became a trap, waiting to be sprung. Field manuals soon reflected this change. Allied training films taught soldiers to fire from concealment, flank or rear only. American bazooka teams practiced ambush drills. One soldier aiming, another reloading, a third spotting the tank's approach. British instructors urged Piat gunners to shoot from beneath cover, a window, a wall, or rubble. The tank, once the symbol of open field dominance, now feared the city and the village, the human maze that nullified its advantage. German commanders responded by pairing tanks more tightly with infantry escorts. Every advance became a dance of coordination. Tanks led, infantry shielded, engineers scouted corners. It was a cautious ballet, born of new fear. Yet for all these countermeasures, one truth lingered. No armor could save a tank from geometry perfectly aimed. The battlefield was no longer about who had the bigger gun. It was about who understood angles and who was willing to wait. The leadership and doctrine angle. Commanders in a new age. When shaped charges arrived, they didn't just change combat, they changed thought. For generals raised on the thunder of cannons, the notion that a man with a tube could kill a tank seemed heresy. But battlefield reports forced adaptation. The British Army, long obsessed with the tank's offensive power, began integrating PAT teams into every infantry platoon. Commanders were told to think of them as mobile obstacles, human landmines waiting in ambush. The U.S. Army, meanwhile, realized that the bazooka's real strength lay in speed and morale. By arming every squad, they gave ordinary soldiers a psychological weapon, the belief they could stand their ground against armor. In Germany, the story was different. With the Eastern Front collapsing, Hitler ordered mass distribution of Panzerfausts to civilians and Volkssturm militias. The weapon's simplicity made it perfect for desperate hands. By 1945, entire streets of Berlin bristled with these single-shot killers. Doctrine followed fear. Tanks could no longer operate alone. Infantry had to clear every building, engineers every trench. Air support became essential not just for attack, but for survival. The very rhythm of warfare, the tempo of assault and defense, had shifted. The Blitzkrieg ideal of 1939, fast armor, deep thrusts, gave way to the slow grind of 1944-45, where each block and bridge could cost hours. The shaped charge had turned speed into liability. Generals learned the same hard lesson their scientists already knew. Power no longer came from mass. It came from precision. The countermeasure angle. Armor fights back. The tank was not finished yet. As soldiers found ways to kill it, engineers found ways to keep it alive. By 1944, German workshops were fitting their tanks with Schürzen, thin metal skirts bolted to the sides of panzers and stugs. The idea was simple. If a shaped charge detonated on the skirt, the jet would form too early, losing penetration before reaching the main armor. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Sometimes, Allied crews quickly noticed that shots which once burned clean through now left only dents. The arms race had entered its next round. Soon, Allied tanks followed suit. Sherman and Churchill crews welded spare tracks and sandbags onto hulls, hoping to create their own standoff armor. Soviet T-34s sprouted makeshift panels and extra plating. Every inch of protection mattered. Every layer, another hope against that invisible lance of energy. But the defenders could only delay the inevitable. The science of the shaped charge was too adaptable. Larger warheads, improved fuses, and better explosives restored its edge again and again. The Germans tried to innovate further, experimenting with Zimmerit, a paste meant to prevent magnetic mines from sticking, though it did nothing against heat. Meanwhile, Allied labs studied spaced armor, sloped plates, and the first hints of what would one day become composite protection. The tank survived the war, but it was never the same creature again. Its myth of invincibility was gone. Its designers had been humbled by a truth that could no longer be unlearned. Sometimes, the smallest weapon changes everything. The angles of war had multiplied, human, scientific, tactical, and industrial. Each revealed the same lesson in a different form. The balance of power between man and machine had tilted forever, and soon, that balance would be tested in fire. Because on the beaches, hedgerows, and city ruins of Europe, these magic bullets would decide not just battles, but the fate of empires. Sicily, 1943. The first shock. The invasion of Sicily was meant to be a straightforward campaign. The soft underbelly of Europe, a gateway to Rome. But as Allied troops came ashore in July 1943, German and Italian armor rolled out to meet them. Panzer fires, semoventes, and the formidable Tiger Is. Beasts of war built for domination. At Gela, British and Canadian infantry dug into the narrow streets and olive groves. The tanks came at dawn, steel grinding against stone, cannon fire echoing down corridors of ruin. The infantry's rifles were useless. Even their anti-tank guns were too far back on the beaches. Then came the new weapon. The Piat, crude, unpredictable, and terrifying to use, was pulled into service. Soldiers aimed from alleys and balconies, holding their breath as the warheads flew in slow, silent arcs. When the explosions came, they were almost too fast to see. A flash, a hiss, then smoke curling from the turret seams. That morning, at least 6 German tanks were knocked out by Piat and bazooka fire. The reports spread quickly through Allied command. The portable anti-tank had worked. Infantry could now hold their ground. The tide was turning, not in the sand, but in the minds of men. For the first time, the battlefield no longer belonged entirely to steel. Anzio, 1944, the ambush war months later, along the Italian coast at Anzio, the Allies were trapped in a deadly stalemate. German armor dominated the open ground. The Piat and bazooka had become lifelines. In one report from February 1944, a platoon of the British North Staffordshire Regiment used Piats to repel a German counterattack. The men fired from ruined villas at less than 30 yards. 5 tanks were destroyed within minutes. The infantry had done what once required an entire artillery battery. By now the Germans had learned to fear the stillness, the quiet street, the dark window. Tankers advanced cautiously, firing their machine guns into every shadow. Yet the ambushers always waited. These weren't reckless attacks. They were calculated acts of geometry. Aim for the sides, wait for the angle. Fire only when the steel is close enough to feel. Every successful hit carried more than tactical weight. It carried a message. The tank could bleed. And each time one burned, the myth of invincibility burned with it. Normandy, 1944. The harvest of fire. Then came the true test. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France. On June 6, 1944, as men stormed the beaches under machine gun fire, the tanks waited inland. Panthers, Tigers, and Jagdpanzers, each designed to dominate at long range. But Normandy was not open ground. It was a labyrinth of hedgerows, villages, and ambushes. The perfect terrain for the new weapons. Bazooka teams crawled through ditches. Piat gunners hid beneath rubble and haystacks. The sound of armor rumbling down a country lane no longer meant hopelessness. It meant opportunity. In one recorded encounter near St. Lo, an American sergeant armed with a bazooka destroyed 2 Panthers at less than 50 feet. In another, Canadian troops ambushed a Tiger tank outside Caen. 2 Piat shots, both to the side armor, left it burning before it could even turn its turret. The Germans adapted quickly, draping tanks with sandbags, spare tracks, and metal skirts. But nothing could stop the fear. Tankers began calling Normandy Die Hexenfront, the Witch's Front. Every field could hide a magic shell. For infantrymen, it was liberation. For tank crews, it was a haunting Warsaw. 1944. The city fights back. The climax of the shaped charge revolution came not from an army, but from civilians. In August 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising, Polish resistance fighters faced overwhelming German armor with little more than homemade Piats and captured Panzerfausts. They struck from windows, sewers, and cellars, turning each intersection into a trap. Panzerfausts, designed to be fired by untrained hands, became the perfect weapon for insurgents. A few seconds of courage could destroy a 50-ton tank. Photographs from the uprising show shattered panzers smoldering beside barricades of cobblestone and debris. For the first time in modern history, civilians had wielded the power to destroy tanks. And for that reason, the German army called Warsaw the City of Ghosts. It was no longer just a military shift. It was philosophical. The battlefield had democratized death. The tank, once a symbol of absolute authority, now trembled before the ingenuity of human hands. Eastern Front, the Red Tide. While the Allies refined their weapons in the West, the Eastern Front became an inferno of Panzerfaust warfare. Soviet soldiers captured thousands of the German launchers and turned them back on their makers. In the chaos of Berlin, 1945, Both sides fought with the same shaped charge technology. Panzerfausts destroyed T-34s, captured ones destroyed Panzers. The line between hunter and hunted blurred completely. Reports from the final battles describe streets littered with burned-out armor, sometimes without a single artillery shell fired. The war's ultimate irony: both armies had mastered the same science, and both had paid the same price. Steel had lost its monopoly on terror. By the spring of 1945, one thing was clear: the tank would survive the war, but its myth would not, because a new truth had emerged from the fire. A single man could now stop a machine built by empires. That realization was the war's true turning point, and its most haunting revelation. The Flood of Fire, 1944 to 1945. By the second half of 1944, the shaped charge had ceased to be an experiment. It had become standard issue. The Allies armed entire divisions with bazookas. The British issued Piats to every infantry company. And in Germany, the Panzerfaust was produced in such colossal numbers that even Hitler called it the people's artillery. The battlefield was no longer defined by who had the heaviest armor, but by who had the most reach. The small, the desperate, and the hidden now dictated the rhythm of engagement. In Normandy, every hedgerow was a trap. In the Ardennes, every ruined barn hid a bazooka. On the Eastern Front, villages became blackened test sites where Soviet and German troops traded the same weapon back and forth. By winter, the shaped charge had rewritten tactics at every level of war. Ardennes, 1944, the winter of steel and fear in. December 1944, the German army launched its final major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Under snow-laden forests and freezing skies, German tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers, roared into the Allied lines. The Americans were caught off guard, their armor outmatched. But they had something the Germans hadn't accounted for: thousands of bazookas. In towns like Bastogne and St. Vith, small groups of GIs turned intersections into death traps. They fired from basements, windows, even foxholes. The heavy tanks, unable to maneuver in the narrow streets, became giant targets. One after another, Panthers were hit by rockets from unseen positions. Sometimes the jet punched through cleanly, sometimes it failed. But the psychological damage was immense. Tank crews hesitated to advance without infantry cover, giving the defenders precious minutes to regroup. For every tank that rolled forward, 3 men waited with tubes and rockets. For every explosion, morale shifted a little more. The German offensive slowed, then stalled. In the cold silence of the Ardennes, geometry once again defeated mass. Panzerfaust nation as 1945 dawned, Germany was collapsing. Yet in its ruins, one last miracle weapon spread faster than any before it: the Panzerfaust. It was crude. It was disposable. It required almost no training. And it worked. Factories across the Reich produced over 6 million units in less than a year. Boys of the Hitler Jugend, old men of the Volkssturm, even civilians were armed with them. For Berlin's final defense, the weapon was handed out by the crate, a last prayer for an empire in flames. In the ruins of Silo Heights and the streets of Berlin, Soviet tank crews learned to fear doorways more than artillery. Entire companies of T-34s were lost to single shots from 10 meters away. The irony was stark. The same principle that had once given Germany the edge, the shaped charge, now empowered those who came to end it. Each detonation was a lesson in humility. Each destroyed tank, a reminder that science serves no master. Allied evolution. Meanwhile, in the West, Allied engineers pushed the bazooka further. The M9, a refined version with a better fuse and a 3.5-inch warhead, improved penetration against German heavy armor. Field modifications turned it into a versatile weapon, not just against tanks, but bunkers and fortifications. Infantry commanders began designing operations around these weapons. Bazooka and Piat teams were embedded in every advance, covering tanks, protecting flanks, and clearing obstacles. In Normandy and the Low Countries, coordination between infantry and armor became gospel. Tanks advanced cautiously, infantry guarded them with anti-tank launchers, and artillery suppressed any suspected ambush. The old idea of a tank spearhead charging alone was dead. The modern combined arms doctrine, the foundation of post-war warfare, was born in those chaotic months. The final lesson: man over machine. By the end of the war, the shaped charge had done more than kill tanks. It had dismantled an illusion, the illusion that power meant protection. Tank design, which once prized thicker armor and heavier guns, now faced a paradox. No matter how strong the steel, a handheld weapon could pierce it. No matter how advanced the engine, a man in a doorway could stop it cold. For generals, it was a revelation, as sobering as it was inspiring. For scientists, it was proof that the battlefield's future lay not in brute strength, but in precision and focus. For soldiers, it was personal, a shift from helplessness to empowerment. In the ashes of cities and forests, one principle had survived every explosion: human ingenuity would always find a way to equalize the odds. The tank was not obsolete, but it was no longer a god, and as the smoke of Europe's battlefields began to clear, armies across the world began asking a new question. Not, how thick should armor be, but how do we survive the shaped charge? The answer to that question would define the next generation of warfare, from the ruins of Berlin to the deserts of Korea and beyond. The age of the tank had not ended, but the age of the man who could destroy it had just begun. The war's silent statistic. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the tally of destruction was beyond comprehension. Entire cities were ash and ruin, empires reduced to memory. Yet amid the wreckage, military analysts noticed something remarkable: a subtle but consistent pattern across the war's final years. Tank losses had spiked, and they weren't being destroyed primarily by artillery or other tanks anymore, across every front. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the ruins of Warsaw and Berlin, infantry launched. Shaped charge weapons had accounted for an unprecedented share of armor casualties. Exact numbers vary by source, but British post-war studies estimated that up to 35–40% of German tanks destroyed in Western Europe fell not to tank fire, but to handheld anti-tank weapons, Piats, bazookas, and Panzerfausts. On the Eastern Front, Soviet archives later revealed similar data. By 1945, shaped charge weapons and magnetic mines had become the leading cause of tank losses in urban and close-quarter fighting. It was a quiet revolution, not in factories or command rooms, but in alleys, fields, and doorways. The age of the superweapon had been challenged by the age of the soldier's weapon. The human cost. The same weapons that empowered infantry also exacted a terrible toll. Firing a Piat or bazooka was never clean, never easy. The blast could injure the gunner, the smoke revealed his position, and the recoil or misfire could be lethal. Many soldiers who destroyed tanks did not live long enough to celebrate it. Veterans of the 1st Canadian Division remembered Piat teams as the bravest men in the unit. In Normandy, of 10,000 Piat operators trained, nearly a quarter were killed or wounded in action, often while reloading or standing to fire a second shot. The same was true for the Germans. The Panzerfaust was simple, but it was a suicide weapon in close quarters. Firing from too short a distance meant death in the backblast. Yet in the final days of Berlin, old men and children still lined the streets with them. Not out of loyalty, but desperation. War had distilled itself to its cruelest equation: a man, a weapon, and a chance. Psychological shockwaves when peace came. Tank crews spoke openly about their fear, something unheard of before the shaped charge. British Churchill crews described the clang of a heat strike as a metallic heartbeat. American Sherman drivers said they learned to dread the pause before the fire. For the first time, armor had felt hunted. German tank commanders, writing after the war, admitted that the psychological toll of fighting under constant ambush was immense. "We no longer trusted the armor," one officer wrote in 1946. It felt like paper against ghosts. The shaped charge had done something no other weapon could. It had dismantled faith. The faith in invulnerability that tanks had carried since the Somme. And in doing so, it reshaped how armies thought, designed, and fought. The doctrinal earthquake post-war military analysis turned into a reckoning. If infantry could carry a weapon that killed tanks, then the entire balance of battlefield power had to be reconsidered. The British Army, once fixated on armor divisions, pivoted toward mixed units. Infantry, armor, and engineers working in mutual support. The tank was no longer the spearhead. It was one blade among many. The U.S. Army, learning from the failures of the Sherman against heavy German armor, poured research into both better tanks and better anti-tank weapons. By 1948, the concept of the tank destroyer, a separate armored unit meant solely for hunting tanks, was phased out. The line between attacker and defender had blurred. And in the Soviet Union, the lesson was even more profound. Soviet engineers concluded that no amount of armor thickness could ensure survival. They began experimenting with angled plating, sloped armor, and spaced protection, leading to designs like the T-54, a direct descendant of shaped charge fear. In essence, the shaped charge had become not just a weapon, but a teacher. Its lessons were written in molten steel and shattered doctrines. The industrial echo factories that once produced the engines of war now turned their focus to studying how those engines had died. Recovered wrecks were dissected like autopsies. Engineers examined entry holes, measured jet angles, and tested different alloys. From this, new branches of material science were born. The study of ballistics, blast physics, and armor metallurgy, what had begun as the witchcraft of war, was now becoming a science of protection. By 1946, British and American laboratories were already experimenting with composite armor layers, steel mixed with ceramics or rubber spacing. German blueprints recovered from bombed research centers revealed early sketches of reactive armor, a concept decades ahead of its time. Each innovation traced its ancestry back to one terrifying discovery. A hollow space in an explosive could change the nature of steel. The shaped charge had begun as a curiosity, evolved into a miracle, and ended as a fundamental law of warfare. But its impact didn't stop when the war ended. It simply changed its form. Because the same principle that tore through tanks in 1944 would soon reappear in the jungles of Korea, the deserts of the Middle East, and the mountains of Afghanistan. A new generation of soldiers would inherit the weapon, and the world would continue to wrestle with its paradox. That something so small could hold such immense, terrible power. From Europe's ashes to the world's blueprints. When peace returned in 1945, the world's armies faced a paradox. They had won the war, but their most powerful machines had been humbled by science, small enough to fit in a soldier's hands. Every major nation began racing to master, copy, or improve the shaped charge principle. In laboratories across Washington, Moscow, London, and Paris, engineers studied captured weapons, Piats, Panzerfausts, bazookas, Panzerschrecks. They measured jet velocities, liner materials, and explosive formulations. Within 5 years, these studies gave birth to an entire new family of weapons, rocket-propelled. Grenades. The most famous of them all would appear in 1949. The Soviet RPG-2. Its design was unmistakable. A direct descendant of the Panzerfaust and bazooka, simple, cheap, and deadly. It spread across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, becoming the weapon of the guerrilla, the partisan, the insurgent. By the 1960s, nearly every conflict on Earth, from Vietnam to Algeria, echoed with its roar. A weapon born in European laboratories had gone global. The magic bullet had become the people's weapon. The new arms race, armor strikes back. But history is a cycle, and every weapon invites an answer. By the early 1950s, tank designers were fighting back. The Soviet T-54, American M48 Patton, and British Centurion all embodied the lessons of the shaped charge age. Their armor was no longer just thick. It was angled, layered, and sloped to deflect jets and distribute pressure. Yet it still wasn't enough. The shaped charge didn't care about weight. It cared about focus. Every increase in armor thickness simply meant engineers built a bigger charge. The race accelerated. By the 1960s, heat shells had replaced traditional armor-piercing rounds in tank guns. Missiles like the French SS-10, the German Cobra, and the American Tau turned the shaped charge into precision-guided death, anti-tank weapons that could strike from miles away. The tank had evolved. So had the threat. But the balance remained fragile. A constant conversation between armor and warhead, protection and penetration. Even in peace, the ghost of the shaped charge lingered over every blueprint. Urban battlefields and the return of the ambush World War II had shown that cities were death traps for armor. The post-war world confirmed it. From Budapest, 1956, to Hue, 1968, from Grozny, 1994, to Fallujah, 2004. The same story played out again and again. Tanks entering narrow streets, ambushed by men with handheld rockets. The geometry never changed. The angle, the weighting, the sudden eruption of fire. By now, the weapon had evolved into dozens of forms: RPG-7s, M72 Laws, Carl Gustavs, and recoilless rifles. The names changed, but the principle remained pure. A hollow cone, an explosive wave, a jet of destruction measured in microseconds. Every soldier trained with it understood the same ancient lesson. No fortress is impregnable. No armor is absolute. The scientific legacy, the shaped charge's influence reached far beyond war. Its principles found homes in mining, demolition, and even space exploration. Engineers used shaped charges to separate rocket stages, cut steel underwater, and drive drilling systems into hard rock. What began as a weapon of destruction had become a tool of precision, the geometry of controlled power. Yet in the military world, its evolution continued. By the late 1970s, new research introduced explosive reactive armor, ERA, small metal tiles packed with explosives that detonated outward when hit, disrupting the incoming jet. Soviet T-72s and Israeli Merkavas carried it first. Western tanks followed suit. The countermeasure worked, for a while. Then came tandem warheads, 2 charges in one projectile. The first to trigger the reactive armor, the second to pierce the main plate beneath. The duel between shaped charge and armor had become eternal, each innovation birthing its opposite. The cultural echo. Witchcraft remembered. Though the science was now well understood, the legend never died. In soldiers' stories and memoirs, the awe persisted. The image of a small warhead melting through steel, the disbelief that something so light could topple a giant. Even decades later, tankers from Normandy and Kursk spoke of the first time they saw one of their comrades' vehicles erupt from within, as if cursed. The word witchcraft lingered because, in a sense, it was true. Not in the mystical sense, but in the way human ingenuity can conjure power out of nothing, bending physics into obedience. In the ruins of Europe, that power had felt supernatural. In the laboratories that followed, it became science. And in the wars that came after, it became everyday reality. From weapon to warning, the shaped charge changed more than tanks. It changed trust. Generals learned to distrust assumptions. Engineers learned to distrust perfection. Soldiers learned to distrust safety. The Second World War had begun with the belief that machines could dominate men. It ended with the realization that the smallest mind could outthink the largest machine. Every modern weapon, from anti-tank missiles to drone-carried munitions, carries that lineage. Every military doctrine that prizes flexibility, precision, and asymmetry owes its birth to that one idea, that focus defeats force. The shell that melted German tanks like butter was never truly about heat. It was about the shape of power, the geometry of fear, and the ingenuity of those who refused to be powerless. And so, as nations rebuilt and historians looked back, One truth echoed quietly through archives, training manuals, and museum halls. The greatest revolution of World War II wasn't the atomic bomb or the jet engine. It was the realization that a hole carved in a piece of metal could undo an empire's armor. The geometry of power in. The quiet that followed 1945, the world's factories turned silent. The clang of steel was replaced by the hum of rebuilding. But deep within laboratories and archives, the memory of one small miracle, a hollow cone of metal, continued to echo. Historians would later call it the democratization of destruction. A single soldier could now wield the kind of power once reserved for artillery, aircraft, or nations. It was the purest expression of 20th century warfare, the victory of intellect over mass. Before the shaped charge, the battlefield had obeyed a simple law. Bigger meant stronger. After it, size meant nothing. A man in a doorway could stop a machine born from an empire's foundry. And that revelation changed everything. Not just tactics, but philosophy. When science looked like sorcery, to the soldiers who first saw it, the shaped charge was impossible. It defied everything they had been taught. That speed, not shape, pierced armor. That firepower, not geometry, won wars. But in those milliseconds of detonation, they saw the truth hidden in physics, that even chaos can be shaped, that energy can be focused, that destruction can be designed with elegance. That's why they called it witchcraft. Not because it broke the laws of nature, but because it revealed them, in a form too sudden, too violent, and too perfect to feel human. Every great leap in war begins as disbelief. The longbow, the musket, the tank, the shaped charge, each seemed unnatural until it rewrote what men thought possible. The legacy of fear and genius today, every tank on Earth bears the shadow of that weapon. Reactive armor plates, composite shells, active protection systems that shoot down incoming rounds before they strike, all are descendants of one idea born in the 19th century and proven in the 20th. Yet, behind that technical triumph lies something deeper, a moral symmetry. The shaped charge didn't just balance soldiers against machines. It balanced imagination against arrogance. For every empire that believed itself untouchable, there would always be an engineer in a basement or a soldier in a trench proving otherwise. War, it seemed, would always be a dialogue between creation and counter-creation, invention and humility. From the ruins, a lesson in the end, the magic bullet that melted tanks was never about fire or heat. It was about understanding how the smallest insight could shift the world's weight. The men who built it weren't magicians. They were scientists guided by logic and geometry. The men who used it weren't sorcerers. They were soldiers driven by survival. But together, they revealed a truth that transcends war. That human minds, when cornered by fear, can shape even chaos into precision. That is both our power and our warning. A final thought. If you walk today through a military museum, you might see one of those weapons, a Piat, a bazooka, or a Panzerfaust, resting silently behind glass. They look crude now, small, obsolete, but their silence hides a story. A story of how, in a world consumed by steel and terror, a handful of men discovered that shape could defeat strength. That the geometry of a cone could humble an empire, and that sometimes the greatest revolutions in warfare begin not with thunder, but with a whisper, a hiss, and a flash of impossible light. Fade out. The screen darkens. A quiet hum. A final line appears. It wasn't witchcraft. It was science, sharper than any sword, smaller than any hope, and strong enough to change the world. If this story moved you, if it made you see history not as pages in a book, but as moments of courage, invention, and fear, then join us. Subscribe for more untold stories of the machines, the minds, and the men who reshaped the world through war. Hit the bell icon to never miss an episode, because the past still has secrets to tell. And if you believe history deserves to be remembered with truth, precision, and respect, share this film. Let others see how one idea, one discovery, can change everything we thought we knew about power. This is your channel name, where history isn't just remembered. It's relived.